This video is sponsored by Hygger. If you've ever wondered why one person can buy 10 cherry shrimp and end up with hundreds, while somebody else also buys cherry shrimp but can't keep them alive for a month, then this masterclass is for you. Over the next few weeks, we're going to build your shrimp keeping knowledge from the ground up. We'll cover everything from choosing the right aquarium and setting it up, through to feeding, breeding, and solving many of the common problems that catch beginners out. The idea behind the series is simple. By the time you've watched every lesson, you'll have everything you need to build and maintain a successful Neocaridina shrimp colony. In today's lesson, we're starting right at the beginning. We're going to choose a tank and look at all the equipment you put in it, including the lights, the filter, and the heater. As always, I've included timestamps in the description. So if there's a section you're already happy with and you don't need to learn more, feel free to move on. So let's start with the aquarium itself. For probably the last 5 or 6 years, I've been saying the same thing. Shrimp don't care what size tank they live in. And I stand by that. Unlike fish, shrimp don't need lots of open space to swim in. They spend their entire lives grazing on the rocks and the wood and the substrate and the plant leaves and the sides of the aquarium. To a shrimp, every inch of surface in an aquarium is usable space. But every time in a video that I say shrimp don't care what size tank they live in, several of you in the comments will say, cool, but what size tank should I get? I suppose it's a fair question. So rather than me just saying shrimp don't care what size tank they live in, let me give you some examples of tanks that I would buy if I was setting up a shrimp tank today. Now, there is a really important caveat about shrimp tank size and the fact that size doesn't matter, and I'll come onto that once I've given you some examples of tanks. The first tank that I'd recommend is the classic 12-inch or 30cm cube aquarium. These tanks hold around 7 gallons, which is about 27 litres, and they make an ideal starting point for the new shrimp keeper. They're large enough to give the new shrimp keeper sufficient water volume to be able to create a stable aquarium, yet small enough that most of us can find a space in our home for a 12-inch cube. They're also reasonably priced. They usually will set you back about $70 or $80, which is about 45 or 50 pounds. Now, I will put links to all the equipment I mentioned in this video in the description below. That way, you can check them out for yourself. Another excellent option is the standard 10-gallon or 37-litre aquarium. It's only slightly larger than the 12-inch cube, but that extra space does give you more room for rocks and wood and live plants, and again, the increased water volume increases stability. Now, these are just suggestions. You can absolutely choose something larger or smaller. The choice is yours. But this is where that important caveat comes in. While shrimp don't care what size tank they live in, stability does. Over the years, I've set up close to 100 shrimp tanks. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that a stable shrimp tank is a successful shrimp tank. In the shrimp hobby, we often say shrimp prefer stable water parameters over perfect water parameters. And that is absolutely true. For example, your shrimp will quite happily live in water that's 70 degrees. And many people would say that's a little cool, but they'd rather live in water that remains consistently at 70 degrees than one which goes from 74 to 78 down to 73 up to 80 and is constantly chopping and changing. They would choose stability over perfect every time. The more water your shrimp tank holds, the more resistant it is to fluctuations in temperature. Think about it this way. A glass of water will heat up and cool down far more quickly than a swimming pool. And the only difference is volume. The exact same thing happens in our aquariums. A 10-gallon cools up and heats down more slowly than a 2-gallon, and a 100-gallon heats up and cools down more slowly than a 10-gallon. So while I will always say shrimp don't care what size tank they live in, you probably should. So I would say buy the largest tank that makes sense for your budget and your available space and go with that. Oh, and there's one more thing I should say when it comes to choosing your shrimp tank. Shape matters. If I'm given the choice between a 10-gallon rectangular aquarium or a 10-gallon bowl, or even worse, one of those column type tanks, I would always choose the rectangle. And the simple reason is surface area. The surface is where the gas exchange happens. The carbon dioxide leaves the aquarium and fresh oxygen is dissolved back in. And we'll talk more about this later in the module when we discuss filtration. But for now, remember this. A larger surface area means better gas exchange. And that is super important for any life in your shrimp tank. Right, with the tank chosen, there are really only 3 pieces of equipment you need. And they are the light, the filter, and the heater. Let's start with the light. Now, when it comes to lighting a shrimp tank, the choice can feel overwhelming. Cheap lights, expensive lights, LEDs, T5s, lights with apps, lights with remote controls. There are hundreds to choose from. After trying a lot of different aquarium lights over the years, my advice is simple. Buy yourself a good quality LED light from a reputable manufacturer that fits your budget. For the vast majority of shrimp keepers, that's all you need. So what do I use on my tanks? Well, that brings me nicely onto the sponsor of today's video. I've been using hygger lights on my own aquariums for quite some time now, and I've been genuinely impressed. In fact, the 12-inch cube tank that sits on my desk, and you'll see me setting up throughout this masterclass, is running the Hygger HG990 full spectrum light. I genuinely think the HG990 is just about the ideal light for a shrimp tank. It's bright enough to grow live plants, and yet that brightness is adjustable, so you can bring it down if you need to. It also has a built-in timer, which I think is one of the most important features of an aquarium light, because maintaining a consistent lighting schedule is crucial in the battle against algae. It even has a nighttime mode, allowing you to display different colored lights in the evening, which adds a fun extra dimension to your shrimp tank. In this shrimp room, I have several hygger lights running, and I honestly don't think there's another light out there that can match performance at the hygger price point. If you'd like to take a closer look at the HG990 or the hygger range, there are links in the description below, or you can scan the QR code on screen. And thank you to Hygger for sponsoring this video. Now, with all of that said, I should point out that the shrimp themselves, they don't actually need a light. They would be perfectly happy living under nothing but the ambient light that enters the room. The shrimp don't care, but the plants do. And of course, we the shrimp keepers, we do quite like to be able to see the shrimp we've just spent money on. So if you're planning to grow live plants in your shrimp tank, which is something I highly recommend you do, then you will need a light. We'll talk much more about plants later in the masterclass. But healthy plants are one of the best things you can add to a shrimp tank. Ultimately, don't get too caught up in comparing hundreds of lights. Find a light from a reputable manufacturer that fits your budget and go with that. Right, let's talk about filters. Filters are probably one of the most hotly debated topics in the shrimp keeping hobby. Ask 10 shrimp keepers which filter you should use, and you'll probably get 11 different answers. Some people swear by a sponge filter. Others wouldn't use anything but a canister. And there are plenty of hobbyists who feel a hang-on back filter is the perfect solution. So who's right? Well, in my experience, they all have their place. But before we can decide which is the best filter for your aquarium, we first need to make sure we understand what a filter does. Most people think a filter just has one job to do. In fact, it has 3. Firstly, it removes physical waste from the water. Second, it provides the perfect home for beneficial bacteria. And third, it circulates water throughout the aquarium, preventing dead spots and creating surface agitation. Once you understand these jobs, choosing the right filter becomes simpler. Let's look at each job in turn, starting with mechanical filtration. Every filter works broadly in the same way. It draws water in, it passes that water over or through some form of media and returns it to the aquarium. As the water passes through that media, tiny particles get trapped. Uneaten food, shrimp waste, dead plant material, and general debris floating around the aquarium. These particles remain trapped in the filter until we service them, until we clean the filter and physically remove them. The second job is biological filtration, and this is by far the most important job the filter performs. Every time your shrimp produce waste, every time food is left uneaten, and every time a piece of plant dies and begins to decay, ammonia is released into the water, and ammonia is highly toxic to shrimp. Fortunately for us, nature has solved the problem. Beneficial bacteria cover surfaces within our aquarium, including the filter media, and get to work converting ammonia to nitrite. Now, nitrite, it isn't much better. It's still highly toxic to our shrimp. Fortunately, nature has solved this problem too, because there's another strain of beneficial bacteria that convert nitrite into the far less toxic nitrate. This entire process is known as the nitrogen cycle, and it's one of the most important concepts in fish and shrimp keeping. Now, although nitrate is far less toxic than ammonia or nitrite, it can build up to levels that become toxic to your shrimp. And our filters, they don't actually remove nitrate from the water. Their job is finished. Once the ammonia is converted to nitrate, they're done. There are filters that will complete the nitrogen cycle. They'll convert nitrates into nitrogen gas, which naturally leaves the aquarium. But they're typically more complicated than most shrimp keepers will want to set up. If you're interested in diving deeper into this subject, then once you finish watching this video, I strongly recommend you look up the work of Dr. Kevin Novak. He's done some interesting research into the subject. Now, for the vast majority of us, there are two simple ways to keep nitrates under control. The first is by carrying out water changes, and the second is by growing lots and lots of live plants. We'll cover both of these topics later in the masterclass. So if you don't feel like you fully grasped the concept of the nitrogen cycle, don't worry for now. The third and final job of a filter is water circulation. Whether a filter is powered by an air pump or an electric impeller, the principle is exactly the same. Water is constantly drawn into the filter, passed through the media, and returned to the aquarium. That constant movement prevents stagnant areas developing in the shrimp tank, and maybe more importantly, creates surface movement. As the surface moves, as there is surface agitation, dissolved CO2 in the water escapes into the atmosphere above, and fresh oxygen is dissolved back into the water. That process is essential for a healthy shrimp tank. So whichever filter you choose, it will be trying to accomplish the same three jobs: mechanical filtration, biological filtration, and water circulation. Different filters simply achieve these jobs in different ways. So which type of filter should you go for? For the vast majority of us, there are essentially three choices: a sponge filter, a hang-on back filter, or a canister filter. Yes, there are other alternatives on the market, like an undergravel filter or a box filter, but the vast majority of people watching this video will choose between a sponge filter, a hang-on back filter, or a canister. Now, before I start comparing these different filters, it's important to point out that each filter type has its supporters. Some hobbyists will tell you sponge filters are outdated, and yet others won't use anything else. Some hobbyists love canister filters, and others will tell you they're simply overkill for a shrimp tank. So rather than me telling you which is the best filter for a shrimp tank, I'm simply going to tell you the pros and the cons of each different type so you can make an informed decision. Let's start with the humble sponge filter. If you ignore everything else I say about filters and simply ask me, Richard, which filter should I go for? My answer would always be the same: a sponge filter. Let me tell you why. Sponge filters work by pumping air from an air pump down a tube and into an uplift pipe. As the air rises through that uplift pipe, it draws with it water, and that water in turn is drawn through the sponge. And it's the sponge that is performing both the mechanical and biological filtration. The sponge traps tiny particles from the water while also providing significant surface area for the beneficial bacteria to colonize. In my opinion, sponge filters are almost perfect for shrimp. They have no moving parts, so there's very little to go wrong. More importantly, there is zero risk of baby shrimp being sucked in. Yes, you'll need an air pump, and in the description below, I've linked to the Tetra Whisper pumps that I favor. But one air pump can easily power 5 or more sponge filters. So what about the downsides? Well, sponge filters, they're not exactly sexy. Unlike a hang-on-back or canister filter, where everything is external, the sponge filter sits inside the tank. So if you're going for the clean, minimalist, highly aquascape look, then the sponge filter is never going to win a beauty contest. They're not glamorous, but they work. Next, let's take a look at hang-on-backs. These tend to be more popular in North America than many other parts of the world. As the name suggests, a hang-on-back filter hangs on the back or even the side of the aquarium. Water is drawn up through an intake pipe into the filter, where it passes through one or more chambers filled with media before returning to the aquarium. One of the biggest advantages a hang-on-back filter has over a sponge filter is you can customize them. You can customize what media is in the filter. Sponge, ceramic rings, lava rock, bio balls. There are dozens of different combinations you can experiment with. However, there are 2 disadvantages you should be aware of. The first of which is flooding. Because the filter sits externally, if it becomes clogged or has a problem, there is always the risk that water pours out on your floor. Unfortunately, this is not just theory. On more than one occasion, I've walked into my shrimp room to hear the noise of water running on the floor. And believe me, it's not something you want to experience. The second issue hang-on-backs have is very specific to shrimp keepers. Those intake pipes are very good at drawing in water, but unfortunately, they're also very good at drawing in baby shrimp. Over the years, I've lost count of the number of people who have contacted me and said, "Rich, my shrimp aren't breeding," only for it to turn out their shrimp were breeding, but the hang-on-back filter was killing all their babies. Fortunately, there is a simple solution to this problem, and that is simply to fit an intake sponge over the intake. Intake sponges are inexpensive, easy to fit, and in my opinion, utterly essential if you're using a hang-on-back. Again, I'll leave links in the description so you can see exactly what I mean. Finally, we have canister filters, and these essentially work in exactly the same way as a hang-on-back, except the filter is sealed and usually lives in the cabinet or a cupboard below your tank. Water is drawn from the aquarium down into the canister, passes through the media and is returned back to the tank. Like a hang-on-back filter, canister filters are highly customizable. There are dozens of different media combinations you can use, allowing you to tailor the filter to your own preferences. Personally, I really like canister filters. I just find they're overkill for a shrimp tank. Where canister filters really come into their own is on larger aquariums where lots and lots of filtration is essential. So which filter should you choose? Well, if you're just starting up, go for a sponge filter. If, however, appearance is important to you, then go for a hang-on-back filter with an intake sponge. Now, before we move on, if you're enjoying the level of detail that we're going into in this masterclass, then you'll be delighted to know everything we're covering is essentially taken from my book, the Neocaridina Shrimp Handbook. At the time of recording, it's the world's best-selling book on cherry shrimp, with over 3,000 copies already sold. If you'd like to dive even deeper into the world of cherry shrimp, it's available as a physical book from Amazon or a digital download from my website. And of course, links to both in the description below. Now, before we move on to heaters, there is one question about filters I get all the time. Do cherry shrimp actually need a filter? And the honest answer is no, not always. But before everyone rushes off and unplugs their filters and then blames me because everything goes wrong, let me explain. In most fish tanks, a filter is essential. We typically overstock our fish tanks, and fish produce a lot of waste. Without a filter, that waste can quickly build up and poison the aquarium. Shrimp are different. Unlike fish, shrimp have a tiny bioload. Several hundred shrimp probably produce less waste than a handful of guppies. Earlier, we spoke about beneficial bacteria and how beneficial bacteria convert the aquarium inhabitants' waste from the highly toxic ammonia to the far less toxic nitrate. We also spoke about the fact that these beneficial bacteria live in the filter. But here's the important part. Those beneficial bacteria, they don't just live in the filter. They actually live on every single surface in the aquarium. They live on the substrate, on the rock and the woods, and the leaves of the plants, and even the aquarium glass itself. In fact, beneficial bacteria typically cover every surface in the aquarium, more or less equally. Pretty much every surface in the aquarium becomes a home to beneficial bacteria. So, because those shrimp produce such a small amount of waste, a mature, well-planted shrimp tank can often have enough beneficial bacteria living on all the surfaces to mean we don't need a filter. Now, that doesn't mean filtration in a shrimp tank is pointless. In fact, far from it. A filter in a shrimp tank just makes life easier. It gives you additional biological capacity. It physically removes particles from the water. And of course, it keeps the water circulating. Now, personally, I do quite enjoy running a shrimp tank with no filter. Again, going back to my 12-inch cube desk tank, that doesn't run a filter. It just runs an air stone. As the air stone bubbles away day and night, those bubbles provide circulation. As the water circulates, it comes into contact with the rocks and the substrate and the plant leaves and of course the aquarium glass, all of which are covered in beneficial bacteria. Essentially, if this is your first or maybe your second shrimp tank, then adding a filter gives you like a safety buffer. But if you've got a few tanks under your belt and you understand how the nitrogen cycle works and you understand how to maintain a shrimp tank, then try going filterless. Right, the final piece of equipment we need to talk about in this module is the heater. And this is another one of those areas where new shrimp keepers can easily overcomplicate. So, do cherry shrimp need a heater? Well, the answer is sometimes, and it essentially depends on where their aquarium is situated. Neocaridina shrimp can quite happily live in cooler water than many tropical fish. They don't need their aquarium particularly warm, and in many homes, especially if the room temperature is fairly stable, you may not need a heater at all. In fact, I would rather keep my cherry shrimp in cooler but stable water than warmer water where the temperature is constantly fluctuating. That word, it keeps coming up, doesn't it? Stability. Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters. A shrimp tank sitting steadily at around 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 to 22 degrees Celsius is usually going to be far better than a tank where the temperature is constantly going up and down. Plus cooler water, it does generally slow your shrimp down just a little bit. They may well grow slightly slower. They may well breed slightly less. But you know what? Neither of those things are necessarily bad. Warmer water, on the other hand, speeds everything up. The shrimp will be more active. They'll grow faster. They'll breed more often. But there is a trade-off. The more active and faster your shrimp live their lives, typically, the shorter their lives will be. So again, we're not trying to chase the warmest water possible. We're trying to create a stable environment for the shrimp. So how do you know if your shrimp need a heater? Well, if your room gets cold overnight, or if the aquarium regularly drops into the mid-60s, or if the temperature in the tank is changing a lot between day and night, then I would use a heater. Not because shrimp need tropical temperatures, but because a heater can help create stability. And that is the whole point. So, the tank, the light, the filter, the heater, they're not here to make shrimp keeping complicated. They're here to help us build a stable ecosystem where our shrimp can thrive. The tank gives us water volume and surface area. The light that helps our plants to grow. The filter gives us circulation. It gives us increased capacity for biological filtration. It essentially increases the margin for error, and the heater, when we need one, helps create a stable temperature. None of this equipment has to be expensive or fancy. It just has to do the job. Because when we strip Shrimp Keeper back to its bones, it's essentially very simple. Create a stable, mature environment. Give the shrimp the conditions they need, and then get out of their way and let them do their thing. In the next lesson, we're going to get away from equipment and we're going to look at everything that turns our shrimp tank from a glass box filled with water into an aquarium. And that's substrate, rocks, wood, and live plants. We'll talk about what you should use, what you might want to avoid, and how these choices can affect the stability of your shrimp tank. Because once all the equipment is in place, our next job is to build the environment where the shrimp can thrive. So if you haven't done so already, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and I'll see you in the next module. Thanks for watching.